Clint Eastwood has spent nearly 70 years on both sides of the camera. He knows exactly how hard it is to make a movie. The years, the money, the thousand things that can go wrong between a good idea and a finished film. Which is why he almost never trashes another filmmaker's work. He knows better. So when Clint Eastwood looks at a film and calls it garbage, that's rare, and it means something. It's happened at least 6 times. 6 movies the most respected man in Hollywood couldn't stomach, and he didn't hold his tongue about a single one. One of them is a film he owed his whole career to. One of them is a masterpiece the entire world calls a classic. And he'll even start by turning that merciless eye on one of his own. Here are the 6 movies Clint Eastwood hated the most. Number 6, Paint Your Wagon, 1969. There is only one way to open a list like this, and that is with the man himself. In 1969, Clint Eastwood, the star of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, 12 months away from Dirty Harry, agreed to make a musical. Not just any musical, a Western musical for Paramount Pictures, with a $10 million budget that would double to $20 million before it was finished. He would play a gold rush prospector named Partner. He would sing, and he would spend the next several decades making sure everyone understood what he thought of the experience. The production was a slow-motion disaster. The studio wanted a prestige roadshow, widescreen, nearly 3 hours long, filmed on location in the Eagle Creek Valley of Oregon, 42 miles from the nearest hotel. It cost $80,000 a day just to transport cast and crew to the set. The fake gold rush town they built, No Name City, cost $2.4 million and took 7 months to construct, including hydraulic lifts under the buildings so they could sink into the earth for the finale. The production hired a nearby commune of hippies as extras. Lee Marvin drank real alcohol throughout the shoot and was frequently unable to perform. The lyricist, Alan J. Lerner, watched his own passion project spiral so far out of control that costs ballooned past anything the studio had imagined. The director, Joshua Logan, fell hopelessly behind. And in the middle of it all stood Eastwood, watching a production burn money by the truckload and learning a lesson he would never forget. By the time it was over, he had made a decision. He was going to direct his own films from now on, because no one was ever going to do this to him again. The film landed with a thud. Roger Ebert wrote that it just lies there in my mind, a big, heavy lump. Paramount wrote off $11 million as a loss. Eastwood, asked about his singing, he performed I Talk to the Trees, was straightforward. What I was doing in that picture was not singing. Asked why he did it at all? I was crazy enough to try anything once. It is the only entry on this list where the man he is criticizing is himself, and it may be the most honest he has ever been about a film. Number 5, MacKenna's Gold, 1969. In 1969, Columbia Pictures was assembling what looked, on paper, like the Western event of the decade. MacKenna's Gold, Gregory Peck, Omar Sharif, Telly Savalas, Edward G. Robinson, a $14 million extravaganza with a cast of legends and a scale to match. Eastwood's agency brought him the offer. Here were the biggest names in the business. Here was the scale. Here was the prestige. Eastwood read the script. Then he said no. His agency pushed back hard. The names, they said, the budget, the opportunity of a lifetime. Eastwood's answer was the same every time. They kept saying, wow, but you get to work with a lot of well-known actors. I said, yeah, but I just don't like the script. He had spoken to Carl Foreman, the producer and screenwriter, on several occasions, and nothing in those conversations moved him. To everyone around him, it looked like career suicide, turning down a star-studded blockbuster to make a small, cheap Western. He did it anyway. He turned down the $6 to $7 million extravaganza and made Hang 'em High instead for $1.5 million. Hang 'em High became a hit and helped cement his American stardom. MacKenna's Gold opened that spring. It cost Columbia $14 million. It made back $3 million. The New York Times called it a Western of truly stunning absurdity. When the film came up in the Paul Nelson interviews years later, Nelson didn't even let Eastwood get there himself. "Oh, that turkey," Nelson said. "That was one of the worst." Eastwood agreed without hesitation. This is not the story of a film Eastwood made and regretted. It is the story of a disaster he saw coming, stepped around cleanly, and watched from a safe distance as it happened to someone else. His instinct for a bad movie, even buried under a mountain of star power and studio money, was already razor sharp, and it would only get sharper and less forgiving. Number 4, The Karate Kid, 1984. Everything so far has been about taste. This one is personal. In the early 1980s, Columbia Pictures offered Eastwood the chance to direct The Karate Kid, a modest coming-of-age story about a bullied teenager who learns karate from an unlikely mentor. Eastwood was interested, with one condition: his son Kyle would play the lead. Columbia said no. What happened next depends on who is telling the story. Sandra Locke, Eastwood's partner of 13 years, whose 1997 memoir is one of the most candid accounts of life inside his world, is specific. Clint had agreed to direct Karate Kid for Columbia only if Kyle played the lead, but they refused. Clint forevermore banned Coca-Cola from his site. Columbia, at that time, was owned by Coca-Cola. Eastwood walked away from the film and, according to Locke, extended the grievance to the product itself, banning all Coca-Cola from his film sets in a declaration of personal war against a corporation that almost certainly never noticed. Kyle Eastwood, in a 2007 interview with The Guardian, softened the story considerably. "I was actually willing to do it. My father was looking at the script originally and then decided not to do it. He ended up passing the script on to somebody else, and it ended up becoming The Karate Kid." In Kyle's version, his father simply moved on. In Locke's version, he moved on while also declaring a multi-decade embargo on carbonated beverages. The truth is probably tangled somewhere between a proud father's disappointment and a grudge that hardened into ritual. And it is worth remembering that the most colorful version of this story comes from an ex-partner who later spent years locked in bitter litigation with him. Take the details as you will. Whatever the exact shape of it, the outcome is not in dispute. The role went to Ralph Macchio. The film was directed by John G. Avildsen, who had already won the Oscar for Rocky. It made $90 million domestic, spawned 3 sequels, a reboot with Jackie Chan, and a Netflix series, Cobra Kai, still running today, nearly 40 years later. It became one of the most beloved franchises in Hollywood history. Columbia's ownership by Coke lasted only until 1989. The ban, by all accounts, outlived the ownership by a considerable margin. Eastwood never called The Karate Kid a bad film. What he did was more revealing. He couldn't hurt the movie, so he quietly declared war on the studio's parent company and carried that grievance into every craft services table on every set he ran for years afterward. Ralph Macchio got the role, Columbia got the franchise, Clint Eastwood got to drink something else. Number 3. Dersu Uzala, 1975. To understand this one, you need to know what Akira Kurosawa did for Clint Eastwood. In 1961, Kurosawa released Yojimbo, the story of a nameless, wandering samurai who plays 2 warring factions against each other for his own survival. 3 years later, Sergio Leone remade it, shot for shot in places, without permission or credit, as A Fistful of Dollars. The samurai became the man with no name, and the actor Leone cast, a journeyman American television player who had been fired from Universal for having a prominent Adam's apple, became one of the most famous movie stars on Earth. He was paid $15,000. Kurosawa noticed. He sent Leone a letter that has since become legend. "Signor Leone, I have just had the chance to see your film. It is a very fine film, but it is my film." Because Japan was a signatory to the International Copyright Convention, he told Leone, he was owed. Kurosawa's company sued. Leone settled out of court. Kurosawa received 15% of the film's worldwide gross and the exclusive distribution rights across Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. And he later admitted he made more money from A Fistful of Dollars than he ever made from Yojimbo itself. That is the film that launched Clint Eastwood. Without Yojimbo, there is no Fistful of Dollars, no Dollars trilogy, and the career that produced Dirty Harry, Unforgiven, and $1 Million Baby looks entirely different. So you would expect a certain reverence. In 1975, Kurosawa made Dersu Uzala, a Soviet-Japanese co-production filmed in the wilds of Siberia, about a Russian explorer and his friendship with an aging hunter who reads the forest with near supernatural instinct. It won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film. Critics consider it among Kurosawa's finest later works. Eastwood watched it. In the Paul Nelson interviews, he delivered his verdict. "I thought that was terrible." One concession: it did have a nice wind sequence in it. That is the entirety of his praise for an Oscar-winning film by the director whose work, rerouted through Leone, made him a star, and made Kurosawa a fortune in the process. Not the performances, not the Siberian landscape photography that critics still marvel at, not the central friendship at the heart of the film, the wind. Eastwood called the rest terrible, and apparently saw no particular irony in delivering that verdict about the one man in cinema he arguably owed the most. Number 2. The Missouri Breaks, 1976. In the entire history of Hollywood, there has never been another pairing quite like The Missouri Breaks. Marlon Brando and Jack Nicholson, on screen together for the first and only time in their careers, directed by Arthur Penn, the man behind Bonnie and Clyde. Both actors were at the absolute peak of their fame, both fresh off Oscar wins, Brando for The Godfather, Nicholson for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It was the kind of event that fills theaters on names alone. Clint Eastwood watched it and called it ridiculous. His verdict from the Paul Nelson interviews? It wasn't a good script, and they obviously felt so too. That last clause is where he goes after the performers directly, and the performer he singles out is Brando. Eastwood's theory is specific. Brando recognized early that the material wasn't worthy of serious investment and made a different calculation, treating the shoot as a chance to collect a paycheck while expending as little of himself as possible. His words: Brando used the production as an opportunity to go off and screw off somewhere. Here is the remarkable part. Eastwood was right. The stories from that set are the stuff of Hollywood legend. Brando rewrote his own character at will, steamrolling the director. He refused to memorize his lines and read them off cue cards scattered around the set. He gave his bounty hunter a lilting Irish accent that he abandoned and picked back up at random, drifting into other voices scene to scene. He wore a series of increasingly bizarre costumes, a full granny dress and bonnet in one scene, other absurd get-ups in others. He invented a murder weapon for his character, a cross between a harpoon and a mace. According to a biography of the star, he frightened his castmates with rubber spiders, mooned the crew repeatedly, and, while filming a scene in a river, took a bite out of a live frog. In his last scene, he talks to his horse as though it were a lover. One critic described him as looking like a hippo on horseback. Brando was, by every account, treating one of the most anticipated films of the decade as his personal playground. So when Eastwood accused him of screwing off, he wasn't guessing and he wasn't exaggerating. He was describing exactly what happened. The Missouri Breaks opened to mixed reviews and disappointing box office. Tonally strange, occasionally brilliant, frequently indulgent, unable to hold its center. It has since been reappraised by some critics as an underrated oddity of 1970s American cinema. Eastwood's reappraisal has not followed suit. What puts this at number 2 is the target. Calling a film ridiculous is one thing. Accusing Marlon Brando, by name, on tape, of phoning in a performance because he wanted a vacation is something most people in Hollywood carry privately and never say aloud. He had just delivered 2 of the most discussed performances in the history of American cinema and collected his 2nd Academy Award. He was not a man whose commitment was casually questioned. Clint Eastwood questioned it, out loud, without hesitation, and it is only the 2nd most audacious thing he said on those tapes. Number 1. The Shining, 1980. There are films you are allowed to criticize, and then there is The Shining. Kubrick's 1980 film has passed entirely out of the category of cinema and into the category of cultural fact. The Overlook Hotel, Room 237, Here's Johnny. The twins in the hallway, the river of blood pouring from the elevator. These images don't belong to a movie anymore. They belong to the language. 45 years on, The Shining is not just considered one of the greatest horror films ever made. It is, by many serious critics, one of the greatest films ever made. Full stop. Clint Eastwood called it a giant failure. In the Paul Nelson interviews, he dismantled it methodically. His opening, it was just a giant failure. His specific complaint? The greatest example in the picture is that there just wasn't anything at all terrifying about it. He had seen it at a Warner Brothers lot screening, surrounded by industry people. He looked around when the lights came up. Nobody had found it scary. To Eastwood, the film had failed its single most basic obligation, a horror movie that doesn't frighten anyone, and no amount of critical admiration could compensate for that in his accounting. Then he went scene by scene. The axe murder of Dick Halloran, played by Scatman Crothers, a moment horror directors have cited for decades as a masterclass in sustained dread. Landed for Eastwood as nothing at all. His exact words? That axe scene, coming in with the axe to hit Scat, it's dead as a dick. He went further, saying that if the film had been made by an unknown director instead of the great Stanley Kubrick, the studio would have bombed it right out of the building. That its reputation rested entirely on Kubrick's name, not on what was actually on the screen. Then he turned to the poster. Kubrick had put a tagline on it, a masterpiece of modern horror. Eastwood found this so presumptuous that it stayed with him for years. His response was to suggest that his own film releasing that same year, Any Which Way You Can, the sequel in which Clint Eastwood co-stars with an orangutan named Clyde, should adopt the very same approach. His proposal? Maybe we should call it a masterpiece in modern comedy and adventure. He was comparing a Stanley Kubrick film to an orangutan sequel, deliberately, on tape. The context is worth knowing, because it shows Eastwood was not entirely alone. When The Shining opened in May 1980, the reception was genuinely mixed. Stephen King, who wrote the novel, hated the film and said so publicly for decades. The Razzies, in their very first year, nominated it for Worst Director and Worst Actress, the only Razzie nominations Stanley Kubrick would ever receive in his career. The nomination for Shelley Duvall was quietly rescinded in 2022 after it came to light that Kubrick had subjected her to punishing conditions on set that left her genuinely depleted. And yet, Roger Ebert, cool on the film at first, came around and called it one of the greatest horror films ever made. Martin Scorsese placed it among the scariest films of all time. Steven Spielberg has spoken of watching it again and again. Time settled the question for almost everyone, except Eastwood. The irony that sharpens all of it: Kubrick and Eastwood were exact opposites as filmmakers. Kubrick was infamous for shooting take after take, dozens, sometimes over 100, grinding through repetition until something broke open inside a scene. Eastwood shot one take, maybe two, trusted the first instinct, and moved on, convinced that spontaneity captured something repetition beat to death. The Shining was the ultimate monument to the exact method Eastwood had spent his entire career rejecting. That he disliked it is not surprising. That he called it a giant failure while the whole world called it a masterpiece, and then reached for his own orangutan comedy as the punchline, is what puts it at number one. Anyone can dislike The Shining quietly in their own living room. Eastwood said it on tape to a journalist without flinching and then kept going. That is the number one film on this list. Not because it is the worst film ever made, it may be one of the best, but because no one else on earth would dare stand up and call it a failure. Clint Eastwood did, and never took it back. What runs through all 6 of these films is the same thing that runs through everything Eastwood has ever done: a complete indifference to what he is supposed to say. No hedging, no softening, no awareness that some opinions are simply too expensive to say out loud. He trashed the film that made him a star. He trashed the 2 biggest actors of his generation. He trashed the most revered horror film ever made. And he opened the whole list by trashing himself. At 96, with a career spanning 7 decades and some of the most celebrated films in American history, Clint Eastwood has earned the right to hate whatever he wants. He always acted like he had. So which one surprised you the most? That he'd call Kubrick's masterpiece a failure, or that he'd turn on Kurosawa, the man who made him a star? Tell me in the comments. And if you enjoyed this one, subscribe. There's a new story about the legends you grew up watching every week. We'll see you in the next one.